Hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining us for the Healthy Communities webinar series, People Pillar, featuring Dr. Lisa Tink and her presentation, Fit to be Canadian, Understanding Exclusion in a Recreation Context. My name is Madison Drader. I am a program officer of events and education with Communities Choose Well. Before we begin, I'd like to begin in a good way with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge the First Nations, the Métis, and all of the people across Alberta who share a history and a deep connection with this land that we live, work, and play on. We dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a good way, in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So like I said, again, I just want to acknowledge I'm calling from Treaty 7 territory today here in Calgary, where I live, work, and play on. Feel free to drop in the chat box where you're calling from today as well. Just a few housekeeping things. We are recording this webinar so we can make it available to you folks and others who are able to attend to view online afterwards. As well, we have a Q&A box, so feel free to give any questions, any and all questions in the Q&A box as Lisa presents. We love questions, so definitely pop them in there or the chat. So before I hand it off and introduce Lisa, I just wanted to give a little background on what the Healthy Communities webinar series is about. So the series is designed to focus on each of the key areas of our Healthy Communities framework. These are also known as pillars, if you haven't heard. These are areas where communities can take action to build a healthier future. Definitely take a look at our Communities Choose Well website if you haven't had a chance to see our framework yet. It's a lot of fun, super interactive, and gives some really good action steps that you can take in different areas. So just a little bit more background on the People Pillar specifically. So the People Pillar focuses on how people are ultimately the building blocks of our communities, and the people in our communities should guide and inform the creation of programs, places, promotions, partnerships, policies, and how participation is encouraged. Within the People Pillar, there's a strong focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion as a tool to build healthier and more engaged communities. So going into Lisa's presentation, I had the opportunity to hear her speak and sit in on her presentation at the ARPA conference. And I just thought the information from her presentation was obviously very important. And I thought it supplemented the People Pillar well. Because the People Pillar talks about how all people should inform what we do in our communities when it comes to health and wellness. I think her presentation really highlights how recreation hasn't actually always been inclusive to all, and there's still a struggle with that, and that how, although we aim to serve people within recreation, there's still those major health disparities affecting marginalized groups that can continue to play a role in their ability to access and participate in healthy eating and active living initiatives. So that's a little bit of background on the People Pillar and kind of how it links to Lisa's presentation. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce Lisa. So Lisa is currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation at the University of Alberta. Her research aims to expose what is inherently problematic, difficult, and dangerous in the inclusion, discourses, practices, and policies used to govern Canada's recreation and sports systems. Prior to returning to academics, Lisa worked as a director of the Government of Alberta's Recreation and Physical Activity Division and manager at ARPA. Lisa is also the co-director of In Situ Change Strategies, a participatory consulting firm that works with a diverse range of community organizations. So Lisa, we're super excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will hand it off to you.
Thank you. It's always so awkward sitting and listening to somebody read a bio that you've sent them.
I know, I'm sorry.
It's all good. So I guess I will just jump into it. Whoops, sorry, jump into it here. We only have an hour together and the presentation is about 45 minutes. So as Madison sort of described, this presentation is based on my dissertation work. I finished my dissertation last September. And since then, I've really been doing a bit of a road and pony show going around. Well, I guess not going around because a lot of it's been online, excuse me, doing this sort of practitioner-based presentation. So my dissertation itself was titled Fit to be Canadian, the Recreation Industrial Complex in Canada. Obviously, for a dissertation, it's a bit more of an academic audience. So what I've tried to do is bring the dissertation to practitioners through this presentation. And it's been well received so far. So hopefully the feedback throughout this presentation is good as well. So like Madison said, we'll just save questions to the end, and then we can probably have more of a dialogue than a Q&A. So I'll just jump into it here. So just before we get going into the actual presentation, I'm going to set the stage with a bit of context. First, you're going to notice that my slides are captioned, and I'm going to be reading from them throughout. This is intentional. It's intended to make the presentation more accessible to anyone who might benefit from having the words available to them while I speak. It also ensures that the full presentation can be accessed online at a later date. The second thing you'll likely notice is that the first half of the presentation focuses on pieces of history that are going to seem unrelated to recreation. But as I'll demonstrate in the second half of the presentation, these seemingly unrelated pieces of history have shaped and continue to shape our recreation and sports systems. The third thing to note, given the nature of this information, is that some of you will likely have a bit of an emotional response. Just note that this is a common reaction to my work. Therefore, if you find yourself feeling defensive, frustrated, angry, sad, I just ask that you do some self-reflection and examine why you might be feeling this way, rather than projecting it on me in the Q&A period. And that has happened many times, which is why the need for this slide in setting the context. And then the last thing I would like to emphasize is that this type of historical work is intended to actually be hopeful. So as the historian Robin Kelly wrote in Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination, social movements do not simply produce statistics and narratives of oppression. Rather, the best ones do what great poetry always does: transport us to another place, compel us to relive horrors, and more importantly, enable us to imagine a new society. So it's therefore at this intersection of what I've sort of been calling hope and resistance that I offer this rereading of recreation history, which begins with a passage from A Framework for Recreation in Canada. So most of you are probably familiar with this passage. It's on page 18 of the framework, and it reads, "Through much of the 20th century, public recreation was regarded as a public good. The emphasis was on accessibility for all, outreach to disadvantaged groups, and a belief in the universal benefits to the whole community, not just to users. In the 1990s, recreation departments and organizations came under increasing pressures for cost recovery and revenue generation, including increases in user fees. Since then, leaders in recreation have continued to stress the need for equitable recreational experiences for all, with a call for the renewed importance of public recreation's historic mandate of addressing the inclusion of vulnerable populations." So as we can see in that passage, the Framework for Recreation is calling for a return to a time when recreation was considered a public good for all. Statements like these are not new. Academics and professionals in various sectors have been making similar calls since the 1980s. Specifically, they've been calling on the recreation sector to resist the principles of what's called neoliberalism, So this is a concept that can be understood as a political framework that stresses profitability, efficiency, and individualism, and a call to return to what they're saying were the social liberal values that have historically driven the field. Now, a central assumption underlying these calls for the recreation profession to return to its historical roots is that municipal recreation services up until the 1980s were available to all members of society. However, as I'm going to demonstrate throughout this presentation, this is a very romantic account of what we claim to be a so-called inclusive past. Like most other activities that helped build and secure the Canadian state, public recreation has been and continues to be an exclusionary site linked to the oppressive and harmful logics of white supremacy. So I recognize that this claim might feel extreme at the moment. So in order to demonstrate exactly how a benevolent institution like public recreation has been and continues to be linked to such harmful logics, I'm going to begin by providing a very brief overview of 4 seemingly unrelated threads of Canadian history. So I'm going to start with a bit of context on Indigenous legislation. I'll move into immigration policies. I'll discuss a few citizen rights and social programs that we've had in Canada. And then I'll talk a bit about scientific knowledges. So beginning with Indigenous legislation, as most of you likely already know, Canadian sovereignty, like other settler colonial states, was accomplished and sustained through a series of struggles between colonizers. So in our case, that's primarily the British and to a much lesser degree, the French, and the colonized, so Indigenous peoples. And despite what many traditional histories tell us, settler colonialism was neither a peaceful nor an orderly process. As I'm going to demonstrate on the next slide, Canadian governments legislated and institutionalized various forms of violence in order to establish and maintain the racial, economic, political, and cultural dominance that was required to develop a settler society on Indigenous territories. So the first example of legislation I have there is the 1749 Scalping Proclamation. So this was a piece of legislation that gave the government of Nova Scotia the ability to provide financial rewards for the scalps and bodies of Indigenous peoples. So essentially, this was a form of legalized murder. The next piece of legislation is the 1850 Act for the Better Protection of Lands and Property. And what this act did was give a British Commissioner of Indian Lands the power to determine who had Indigenous status, and therefore what crown lands, i.e. reserves, they were able to hunt on, live on, farm on, etc. So basically, this was a form of segregation that was intended to separate Indigenous peoples from European settlers. The next piece of legislation there is the 1876 Indian Act. So this act actually consolidated all of the existing Indigenous legislation prior to it into one very comprehensive and long document. In doing so, Indigenous peoples who had not assimilated, so again, those that were deemed status Indians, were deemed wards of the state, meaning they weren't legal citizens, and their cultures were erased and their day-to-day activities were managed and controlled through this document. So again, this is a very comprehensive document and there's a lot in it, but these are just a few examples of how they controlled their day-to-day activities. All Indigenous peoples needed a permit to sell grain. Settlers did not. And settlers were actually prohibited from buying grain directly from Indigenous peoples. Cultural practices were banned. So for example, in 1876, the potlatch ceremony was banned. In 1914, all off-reserve dancing was banned. And in 1925, Indigenous dancing was banned altogether. And it is worth noting that the Indian Act was actually modernized in 1951 and 1985, but this act is still in effect today. The next piece of legislation we have there, or I guess it's a federal policy here, is the pass system. So this federal policy actually kept Indigenous peoples confined to reserves by requiring them to obtain a pass from a federal Indian agent in order to both leave and return. So for approximately 60 years, this policy controlled the movement of Indigenous peoples with the goal of keeping them on reserves and once again away from settlers. And then the last one there is residential schools. So I'm sure most of you know at this point that these were mandatory government-run schools where thousands of Indigenous youth died from abuse, starvation, and treatable illnesses. And the last school was only closed in 1996, which, for a bit of context, I was already 13 years old at that time. So as we can see from just these few examples, there were many, many more I could have pulled from. It was through legal forms of bodily, cultural, and administrative violence that the Canadian state was able to secure control over Indigenous lands, eliminate their claims of Indigenous sovereignty, and absorb Indigenous peoples into the colonial regime that sought to erase their entire culture. Immigration policies, on the other hand, operated very differently. So unlike Indigenous peoples, immigrants were constituted by the British and then later the Canadian government as an external rather than an internal threat. It's for this reason that Indigenous peoples and immigrants were governed. So that basically means eliminated and controlled in very different ways. So in an immigration context, the first exclusions were actually economic exclusions, and they focused on limiting the landing of those individuals considered diseased, worn out, and unprofitable, making them incapable of useful labor and honest industry. So anything in quotation marks has been pulled directly from a piece of legislation. This actually resulted in legislation that was intended to limit the landing of individuals considered to be incapable of supporting themselves in a capitalist society. So just one example there, according to the 1848 Immigration Act, this included anyone deemed too diseased to work, children without parents, anyone over 60, unwed mothers, and anyone the government labeled a lunatic, idiot, deaf, dumb, or blind. So essentially anyone who had no laboring capacity. Towards the end of the 19th century, however, racialized exclusions became just as important as the economic exclusions. So prior to this time, pretty much any immigrant who could be put to work was treated as a tolerable asset in Canadian nation building. So an excellent example is the healthy Chinese men who were given immigrant status to build the railway, which was very dangerous work. But as the racist and ableist discourses of eugenics, and for those of you that don't know, eugenics is a pseudoscientific program that actually sought to increase the number of Canadians considered physically, mentally, and morally fit. So basically meaning white, straight, cisgendered, able-bodied Christians, while eliminating those considered unfit. So basically anyone who was non-white, disabled, gay, transgendered, or non-Christian. So as these racist and ableist discourses of this scientific program that was called eugenics actually became more popular, so too did the programs and policies that sought to eliminate all of these degenerates from the population. So this actually resulted in a number of immigration policies that were intended to secure what Prime Minister John A. Macdonald at the time called the Aryan character of future British America. So again, just a few examples of how the immigration policies sort of reinforce this notion of an Aryan Canada. The 1885 Chinese Immigration Act. So what this piece of legislation did was introduce a head tax of $50. So that's about $1,500 today in an attempt to reduce the number of Chinese immigrants coming to Canada. The logic behind this act was that Chinese individuals, especially those who could not afford the tax, were not evolved enough to achieve the intellectual and moral expectations of the superior white civilization we were trying to form here in Canada. The next example is the 1910 Immigration Act. So this act actually prohibited the landing of, quote, immigrants belonging to any race deemed unsuited to the climate or requirements of Canada. So in other words, what this clause did was restrict immigration from warmer non-white countries, so Africa, South Asia, and Southern Europe, without actually having to use explicitly racist language. And then the last example there is the 1919 Act to amend the Immigration Act. So within this act, anyone deemed undesirable because of, quote, customs, habits, or modes of life, so again, very subjective terms there, was now prohibited from immigrating to Canada. So in other words, anyone who threatened the purity of the population due to what was perceived to be a lack of whiteness, Christianity, or capitalist lifestyle could be labeled as being un-Canadian by the government and denied entry. It's worth noting that this version of the Immigration Act actually remained almost completely unchanged until 1976. So in addition to developing this comprehensive system of immigration legislation that was intended to keep Canada white, the colonial state also used a number of laws and programs to reinforce both the superiority and security of primarily white heterosexual able-bodied men. So again, just a few examples of how we did this legislatively. So the 1885 Electoral Franchise Act. So this act disenfranchised women, Indigenous peoples, and people of Chinese heritage. It also required people to earn a certain annual income and own or rent a house of specific value, which indirectly disenfranchised a number of Black migrants, French settlers, and Irish immigrants. It is worth noting that this version of the act was repealed in 1898. However, women still didn't get the federal vote until 1919. And in many provinces, the provincial vote came a lot later. So it didn't even come until 1940 in Quebec. Racialized exclusions were only removed in 1948, with the exception of Indigenous peoples who couldn't vote until 1960. And then property-based qualifications for voting were not completely removed until 1948 as well. The next example I have there is the 1890 Criminal Code. So within this code, male homosexuality was illegal, and it remained illegal until 1969. In 1953, during the Cold War, when all the purge campaigns were going on, so this was when people that were thought to be homosexual were being fired from federal employment. So when this was happening, the prohibition was actually extended to women, meaning being a lesbian was also illegal from 1953 until 1969. And then the last example I have there is the 1944 Unemployment Insurance Act. So this act was intended to provide financial assistance to unemployed persons. However, those who were considered ill, injured, pregnant, too old to work, if they were fired from their job, if they left their job without what was deemed to be just cause, if they refused any type of employment, regardless of unsafe working conditions, if they participated in strikes or work stoppages, or if they weren't previously employed full-time, they were all ineligible for this support. So what this basically meant was that in addition to denying assistance to people who were sick, old, or pregnant, this so-called universal welfare program, that's how it's celebrated today, also excluded most women and racialized people because they tended to lack full-time employment opportunities during this time. It also excluded gay people who would have been fired for their illegal sexuality during the purge campaigns, and anyone who was against exploitative labor practices and publicly supported unions. So again, this act remained largely unchanged until 1971. So returning now to this idea of keeping Canada white, we can see how from the mid-1700s until the mid-1970s, which really isn't that long ago, the Canadian state used a comprehensive system of legislation that gave priority to white people over non-white people, cisgender men over all other genders, heterosexuality over homosexuality, able working bodies over disabled non-working bodies, Christianity over other religions, and the economy over humanity. So it's important to note here, however, that these harmful and oppressive acts of legislation were not simply based on the beliefs of a few racist politicians. So that seems to be a narrative that we're drawing on in contemporary society. However, science, like the law, was also used to justify these legal acts of elimination and control. So again, just a few examples here. The book titled Systema Natura, which was published in 1758 by Carl Linnaeus, and he's now described as the father of taxonomy. So this was a scientific text that actually used geography to divide the human species into 4 hierarchical types. So we have European white, American reddish, Asian tawny, and African black. And within this hierarchy, Europeans were constituted as both morally and physically superior, so they were constantly placed at the top. And Africans, on the other hand, were constituted as having the most negative moral and physical attributes, so were consistently placed at the bottom. Another example here is the 1799 Human Chart. So this was published by Charles White, and this chart was actually based on a number of abstract skull measurements that ordered human varieties according to what was called the Great Chain of Being. So this was actually a scientific hierarchy that placed God at the top and progressed downwards to plants, animals, and minerals. And his chart included these following categories: the Grecian antique, the Roman painter, European, Asian, American savage, Negro, and ape. So once again, the order is important to note here by situating the Negro alongside the ape and Europeans alongside the godlike figures of the Roman painter and Grecian antique. This chart not only reified the notion that Europeans were the most advanced segment of modern humanity, it reinforced a commonly held belief that Africans were the most animalistic of the human species, with the American savage, which were indigenous peoples, just being slightly above them. And then the last text here, which you might be more familiar with, is The Descent of Man. So in this text, Charles Darwin applied his theory of biological evolution to the human species and suggested that humans, like other life forms, actually evolved slowly from one common ancestor. So while this line of intellectual thinking did a lot to discredit the earlier beliefs of religious creationism, so the great chain of being that someone like Charles White was using, it actually did nothing to eliminate the notions of white supremacy. So like earlier scientists, Darwin also believed that there were gradations, again, this is a quote from his text, between the highest men, the highest races, and the lowest savages. So therefore, despite his contribution to the idea that all members of the human race can be traced back to one common ancestor, he still believed in an evolutionary hierarchy that constituted white Europeans as biologically superior to all other races. So, excuse me, as demonstrated by these few examples, white European men used science to position themselves as politically, culturally, spiritually, and economically superior to all other races. That being said, towards the end of the 1800s, it wasn't just race that was the concern of these scientists. Beginning around 1885, any form of unfitness or abnormality, again, conditions we could now classify as poverty, same-sex desire, disability, mental illness, the inability to have children, all of these types of conditions were to be eliminated from the Canadian population. So the result was the circulation of a number of new scientific knowledges that actually reinforced the development of various racist, heterosexist, and ableist programs and policies. So again, I'm just going to provide a few examples here. The first one is vitality theory. So according to this medical theory, women were chronically weak and had only finite mental and physical energy, largely because of our menstruation, it was sort of thought. As such, they needed to limit both mental and physical activity. And this is why we weren't able to do things like attend university, work in particular jobs that required physical exertion, or participate in competitive sports. The next one there is eugenics. So we've kind of discussed this a little bit, but it was officially defined as the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of the generations, either physically or mentally. And this concept was actually coined by Charles Darwin's cousin. So what eugenics did was provide the scientific rationale necessary for a comprehensive network of policies and practices that would once again eliminate the unfit, while simultaneously encouraging the survival and reproduction of the best in all classes. So those quotes are taken from an academic paper, and the best in all classes were called human thoroughbreds at this time as well. In a Canadian context, this meant developing a comprehensive network of laws, policies, and practices that supported the health, wealth, and security of those deemed desirable or fit. So again, some examples could include things like pension programs, unemployment insurance that I talked about, the farm settlement programs that were used, and various public health campaigns. At the same time, a different set of laws, policies, and practices were used to eliminate, segregate, and reform those deemed to be undesirable or unfit. So some of these examples could include mandatory sterilizations, involuntary institutionalizations, the racist immigration policies that we went through, or residential schools is another really good example there. The next example I have is population level statistics. So this is a scientific method that in many ways emerged in response to Hitler's eugenics program. And it's actually a method that people still use today. So unlike eugenics, this type of statistical thinking does not suggest that entire races are unfit or unhealthy. It does, however, use statistics to suggest that people from a particular race are probably, likely, or maybe unfit or unhealthy because most, many, or some of the individuals in that race are. So the reason that this scientific method is so very dangerous is because it ignores all the social, economic, and political factors that actually cause people of particular groups to be less healthy than others. So it ignores things like wealth, the neighborhood which you might be living in, educational inequities, things like that. And then the last example I have there is the conjugal family theory. So this was a sociological theory that outlined the roles and boundaries of the traditional family. So again, this is a quote taken directly from an academic paper that was published in 1943. And it reads, "The conjugal family unit of parents and children is one of basic significance. To be the main breadwinner of his family is the primary role of the normal adult man. Consequently, housekeeping and the care of the children is still the primary functional content of the adult feminine role." So as we can see from this academic passage, the normal family was a heterosexual unit of two parents and their healthy offspring. At the head of the unit was an able-bodied man capable of success in the labor market and therefore capable of supporting his wife, who was expected to remain at home with their children. And the families that did not fit this definition were deemed abnormal and therefore sometimes were not worthy of the state supports that were provided. All right, so you're probably sitting there wondering, what the heck does all this have to do with public recreation? So as I'm going to demonstrate, public recreation was actually produced by and reinforced the very same logics used in the creation and implementation of Indigenous legislation, immigration policies, and other settler colonial laws and social programs. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to begin with supervised playgrounds. So our earliest playgrounds are often described as benevolent laboratories where habits of health and social custom could be taught in a play atmosphere. So that's actually a quote from Elsie McFarlane's book. Elsie was very influential here in the Alberta recreation scene. She was the first woman director in our government branches and also worked at the University of Alberta as well in the rec sector. However, as I'm going to demonstrate, these laboratories were also sites where the logics of settler colonialism, racism, classism, sexism, and ableism were all reinforced in a number of ways. So first of all, the majority of men and women who campaigned for and ran supervised playgrounds were also avid supporters of the eugenics movement. Interested in ensuring the biological purity, so once again, read whiteness, straightness, and able-bodiedness of the entire Canadian population. These individuals believed playgrounds were sites where white, lower-class children could be inoculated against a number of biologically inherited pathologies, so things like poverty and criminality. And it was actually believed that those were biologically inherited at this point in time. The overall goal in eliminating these pathologies was to make white lower class children more fit for both industrial and domestic labor and less dangerous to the middle and upper classes. So the focus on the white lower class is really important to note here. By the time the playground movement started, almost all Indigenous peoples were living on reserves or in residential schools. Additionally, due to the use of the racist immigration policies that we went through, the majority of immigrants during this time were from Western Europe. So as we can see in 1911, 97% of Canada's population was of Western European descent. And that actually increased slightly in 1921 to 97.5%. Therefore, while our contemporary narratives actually suggest that playgrounds were sites for all vulnerable and at-risk children, the racial makeup of our settler colonial towns and cities was one of the major reasons lower-class white children were actually the targets of the playground movement. That being said, the racial makeup of our settler colonial towns and cities was not actually the only reason racialized children were absent from our earliest playgrounds. Racist tropes such as the savage Indian and blackface minstrels were very, very common during playground games and performances. Such characters not only normalized racist attitudes, they also constructed a white Canadian identity that was opposed to any non-white other. So therefore, as I argued in my dissertation, even in the absence of explicit racialized exclusions, it can be assumed that non-white children would be hesitant to voluntarily attend programming that suggested they were inferior or degenerate others. In addition to reinforcing the notion that white people are superior to non-white people, playgrounds also reified the notion that men are superior to women and society should be organized as such. So within this line of thinking, lower class boys were to become fit for wage labor and or military duty. Team games and sporting competitions were therefore used to teach physical efficiency, a respect for authority, and a loyalty to the British Crown. Lower class girls, on the other hand, were taught proper domestic habits through instruction in sewing, knitting, and crafts, and non-strenuous activities, that is those that were believed to be safe for their reproductive systems. Again, our roles as mothers was very important here, such as dance and other appropriate games were also used in an attempt to strengthen their bodies for their future maternal duties. So while it's not inaccurate to suggest that playgrounds were intended to teach working class children the habits of health and social custom, a deeper reading of these recreational sites allows us to see that the habits and customs that were actually taught reinforced white supremacist logics, which suggested white people were superior to non-white people, men were superior to women, marriage and heterosexuality were superior to not getting married or being homosexual. Able working bodies capable of producing healthy offspring were superior to disabled bodies unable to work, and that Christianity was superior to other religions. So the next example I have is swimming pools. And like swimming pools, like playgrounds, our earliest swimming pools are often positioned as sites intended to improve the health and hygiene of the working class. But however, again, I'm going to demonstrate our earliest swimming pools also served other objectives of the settler colonial state through a variety of racialized and classed exclusions. So racialized exclusions were largely justified by a notion that non-white people, especially Black people at this time, were carriers of diseases that would ooze off in the water and mongrelize the British race. Contact with the lesser races was therefore controlled using a number of bylaws. So for example, Edmonton had a 1923 bylaw banning all Black people from parks and swimming pools. We also used other segregation measures such as white-only areas or white-only schedules. In addition to these racialized exclusions, the pay-to-play model adopted by our earliest public swimming pools also served as an exclusionary measure, much like it does today. So to demonstrate this, we can look at Toronto's Harrison Baths. Opening in 1909, these public swimming and bathing facilities were intended for Toronto's lower classes and were strategically located just a few blocks away from the city's most notorious slum. And it's often assumed, given this location and the target demographic, that access to these public facilities was free, but that was not the case at all. In order to prevent what one alderman described at the time as abuse of privilege and also provide a revenue to help meet current expenses, admission fees were charged. So these are arguments we hear today from our elected officials. So same sort of justification for charging fees. So for example, in 1909, entry to the pool was 10 cents. This increased to 15 cents in 1919 and 25 cents in 1924. These amounts are roughly the equivalent of between $2.50 and $3.75, costs which are comparable to many swimming pools today. And it is worth noting that these admission fees were not limited to the indoor bathhouses. Outdoor swimming pools, which became very popular across Canada after World War I, also charged an admission fee. So for example, Toronto's Sunnyside Pool charged 35 cents for a single adult admission in 1922. That's the equivalent of around $5.19 today. So again, very comparable to what we're charging today. So once again, as I argued in my dissertation, despite being provided for through the public budget, swimming pools were always designed to serve a primarily white private buyer. All right, so as I've demonstrated up until this point, from the early 1900s until the early 1930s, playgrounds and swimming pools were used as a technique of social reform, primarily intended for the white lower classes. However, after World War II, recreation's objectives changed significantly. So responding to concerns about Hitler's eugenics program, as well as the ways the Nazi regime was using recreational programming to cultivate soldiers, many Canadian recreationists began to reject this notion of state-sponsored activities by suggesting that health and social reform should be left to social workers and other healthcare providers. The result was the emergence of a new professional field, one that positioned recreation as a freely chosen, self-directed activity to be pursued by individual consumers. So those of you familiar with the framework for recreation will notice that there's a definition that's very similar to that in the 2015 document. However, as other recreation historians have noted, this notion of the freely choosing, self-directing individual consumer was neither classless, genderless, nor raceless. From the late 1940s until the late 1970s, facility allocation and programming were developed according to the express needs of middle-class white men and boys. So to demonstrate this, we can look at a passage from an academic paper about Edmonton Community League rinks, which states, despite having nearly 2,000 girls enrolled in figure skating programs in 1964, only 64 hours per year of indoor ice was allocated to these programs. Outdoor rinks were substandard for serious sports like boys hockey, but perfectly suitable for less important and fringe sports such as girls figure skating. So this passage, although it is specific to community league ice rinks, is actually a perfect example of how gender-based power relations were reinforced during Canada's community centre movement. Not only was hockey prioritized over figure skating, the fact that hockey was deemed a boys' sport and figure skating was deemed a girls' sport reinforced the sexist discourses, which reduced girls to future wives and mothers and suggested they were biologically, anatomically, and temperamentally unfit for intense competitive sport. It's also worth noting that in addition to reinforcing the notion that women were inferior to men, these community league ice rinks also marginalized lower class and racialized individuals, and they did this in two ways. The first was location. So predominantly located in suburban neighborhoods, these facilities excluded many non-white and lower class people simply by virtue of their socioeconomic geography. And then the second was a lack of public or low-cost opportunities. So in many indoor rinks, public skating was actually eliminated as an economy measure. So that's a quote from a Globe and Mail article. And as a result, individuals had to be a member of a figure skating club or an amateur hockey team, activities where participants were almost entirely white and middle to upper class to access these publicly funded facilities. So again, these are issues that we're dealing with today, and they did actually exist back in the 60s as well. And once again, the makeup of our settler colonial towns and cities is really important to note here. I just find this really interesting. So according to the census in 1961, Canada's population was 91.9% white. So when we're thinking about why and how our recreation facilities cater to white members of the public, they were primarily developed during this time where we were a very white dominant nation. So therefore, just as playgrounds and swimming pools reinforce the white supremacist logics of capitalism, racism, sexism, and heteropatriarchy, so too did the community recreation centers that were developed for primarily white settlers between the late 1940s and the late 1970s. In this new configuration, however, these public investments were no longer intended to control the health and bodies of the lower classes, to make them more fit for labor and less dangerous to the wealthy classes. So again, supervised playgrounds and swimming pools were a bit more focused on that social reform rationality. Instead, community recreation was now seen as a way to maximize the health and individual freedoms of the better off in an effort to improve their quality of life in a democratic society. So returning now to the contemporary discussion about this rise of neoliberalism, which I mentioned at the beginning, and the negative impacts of our current consumer-based recreation system, we can see how there are reasons to be critical of how our traditional histories have romanticized the recreation field's inclusive roots. So as I've demonstrated, from the early 1900s until the late 1970s, playgrounds, swimming pools, and community recreation centers all reinforced white supremacist logics, which gave priority to white people, cisgendered men, heterosexuality, able working bodies, Christianity, and basically the economy over humanity. Therefore, while the neoliberal principles of profitability, efficiency, and individualism have indeed contributed to the exclusion of marginalized groups, neoliberalism is only one of many rationalities that have created the conditions for a contemporary recreation system that excludes, by our sector's own admission on pages 22 and 23 of the Framework for Recreation, children and youth from disadvantaged families, older adults who are frail and/or isolated, women and girls of all backgrounds, individuals from diverse and racialized backgrounds, persons with disabilities, Aboriginal peoples, and individuals with non-normative gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientations, and sexual identities. To suggest otherwise, as the contemporary calls to return to this inclusive past tend to do, not only ignores the ways the logics of things like Western exceptionalism, British imperialism, settler colonialism, capitalism, racism, and heteropatriarchy, both produced, but were also reproduced in public recreation settings. It also fails to acknowledge how each of these oppressive and harmful logics are actually interrelated components of white supremacy. It's therefore my argument that in order to advance this call to increase inclusion and access to recreation, we must put aside nostalgic tendencies that position earlier forms of public recreation as sites of equal opportunity, and acknowledge the ways our sector has been and continues to be entangled in the various components of white supremacy. In other words, we must recognize that those things which appear to be unrelated, so Indigenous genocide, racist immigration policies, the oppressive notion of the traditional family, and many other harmful policies and discourses, have actually collectively created the conditions for a recreation system that not only excludes most members of Canadian society, but also increasingly values profit over participation. So I recognize that is a lot. So at this point, you're probably asking, what do we do with all of this information? And I'm not actually here to offer any prescriptive actions or solutions, as I myself don't necessarily have the answers. But I would argue that the first thing we need to do is accept that we have a responsibility for writing the next chapter of history. Yes, you and I are not responsible for the policies and practices of the past. We cannot change what went on, but we also can't continue to deny that it happened. We can't continue to ignore the ways that white supremacy, again, meaning settler colonialism, racism, heterosexism, ableism, and exploitative capitalism, shaped and continue to shape our society. And we can't continue to justify the ways some families, definitely mine, likely many of yours, have benefited and continue to benefit from things like Indigenous genocide, racist immigration policies, and the many other policies and discourses that operate on the notion that some people are superior or more valuable than other people. So in closing, I'm just going to offer 3 strategies that might act as starting points for creating more equitable, diverse, and inclusive recreation and sports systems. So the first is to do your work of learning and unlearning. If we are truly interested in creating equitable, diverse, and inclusive recreation spaces, those of us in positions of power must undergo an ongoing process of critical reflection. So rather than continually asking, what action can we take right now? And I think recreation practitioners are really good at action. We do need to slow down and engage both individually and collectively with the many harmful elements of our nation's colonizing and supremacist history. But the work doesn't stop just on that reflection, within that reflection process. Creating more just recreation systems will also require that we understand the ways the harmful pieces of the past continue to shape the policies, practices, and people that are existing in our present. As the social justice scholar Sean Ginwright has noted, lasting social change requires that people not only struggle against existing institutions, but that they also make a philosophical and spiritual leap to become more human beings. So in other words, if we want to change or transform our recreation systems, we must also begin to change and transform ourselves. The next strategy I would offer is to address the myth that recreation is apolitical. So we know, and we've known for a long time, that the 2 biggest factors affecting participation are money and time. Yet as a sector, we remain uninvolved in any of the political efforts that would allow for increases in both of these things. So we're not involved in conversations about living wage legislation, tax reform, childcare legislation, things like that. Therefore, instead of addressing the systemic issues that could actually give people more money and time, we tend to develop surface level reforms that attempt to remove barriers at the individual or organizational level. So for example, the two most common interventions are time-consuming grant programs that cover registration fees. So those would be things like our low-income passes in municipal facilities or kids sport programming, as well as investments in activity that provide only brief moments of participation. So we do a lot of sport sampling days, short-term program grants for activities that will run from 1 day up until 1 year. And choosing to focus on these surface level reforms while avoiding strategic discussions about social justice is actually a political statement of its own. So how, where, when, and why we engage in recreation and sport has largely been determined by structural conditions that have privileged white, middle to upper class, heterosexual men, and then later to a lesser degree women. Therefore, if we're truly interested in creating more equitable, diverse, and inclusive spaces, we need to acknowledge that sport is political and start to find common cause with the agendas that will contribute to the transformation that we're actually claiming to seek. So again, things like living wage legislation, tax reform. And then the last one is stop discussing EDI and do something about it. So in other words, it's my suggestion that we must abandon the traditional models of recreation and sport for development or social inclusion. So these are models that have historically attempted to fix particular populations and replace them with new transformational models of social justice. So these are models that value the lived experiences and agency of historically excluded groups, by giving them control over their own sporting and recreational opportunities. This will require organizations and funding bodies to redistribute resources in order to make greater investments in the programs and activities that are organized and led by those who have been and continue to be excluded from our traditional recreation systems. So that is it. I'll just give a shout out to my supervisory committee, and then Rick Curtis and Gary Debney. Those names might be familiar to some of you on this call. They really championed this work. The Canadian Training Network for Parks and Recreation actually funded me the last 2 years of my dissertation and paid to have it published into a book. So for those of you who are wanting to do a deeper dive, I do have a book that is available on all online platforms if you're wanting to read a bit more. But yeah, they've been champions of this work from the beginning, and I'm so grateful to them. All right, so thank you, and I will turn it over to Madison to see if we've got any questions from those of you on the call.
Yes. So this is the second time hearing this presentation, but definitely continue to learn something new from it. And it's still like, even though I've heard it before, it's still very like heavy and shocking to rehear some of the history. But I just appreciate so much how you give us that history and then really tie it back to recreation, because it's so intertwined and it's so related to how it ends up affecting the work we do. So I really appreciate that. It looks like we do have one question, just asking if there's data on who is accessing recreation and recreation facilities now. So I think you gave like that data from 1960.
Yeah, so that was just census data on who was living in Canada at the time. I don't have that data offhand. I don't do any sort of quantitative work on rec facilities with my research. I do know that there is a group, Mike Roma is one of the individuals leading it, but they've developed a software that recreation facilities can access, and they are starting to track that data. I don't think we have it at a provincial or a national level. I don't even know if municipalities are collecting it. It would almost be a question that I would need to turn over to some of those individuals working at a municipal level. So based on my knowledge, I don't think we have a sort of systematic database that captures who is using our facilities at this point. But if anybody wants to write in the comment box if I'm wrong, then feel free to chip in. It's not within my area of expertise. I do critical theory work, so numbers and stuff are so beyond my intellect.
Yeah, perfect. If anyone does have any thoughts or ideas on that, yeah, feel free to throw it in the chat box now that I have that working, because I didn't have it working in the beginning. It doesn't look like we have any other questions.
I'll just say for those of you still listening that I've found when I do these presentations and people aren't able to engage verbally with me, it is hard to conceptualize a question and type it into a text box. So this isn't uncommon to not get questions in this way. It tends to be more of sort of us collectively fumbling through how we're feeling, and like a question will sort of emerge. So I'm not surprised that typing a question might feel intimidating and hard to articulate, and you're probably still processing because there was a lot of information. So yeah, don't worry about the lack of questions at this point, but I would offer, if something comes up and you would like to reach out to me, my email is still up on the screen there, so feel free to email me directly.
Perfect. And we have quite a few thank yous in the chat box. Just saying like, thanks for the suggestions, things we can start working on. It's a lot of info to process. Someone did also acknowledge that, but we'll probably have questions later. I feel like I have so many questions, but hard to put into words. Yes, Danielle, I feel the same way. I've been trying to think of a question the entire time, but I think it's definitely information we kind of need to sit with and think about. Oh, here's a question. I'm wondering if you can comment how this work might inform work that we do in communities on supportive municipal environments.
So outside, I'm taking that to be a bit outside of a recreation context and more of a community development context. Would that be a correct assumption?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that obviously the recreation specific pieces might not be as relevant if you're in more of a human services kind of community development area. That said, I think the logics and sort of the ways in which legislation has been woven throughout our past would have shaped or given a similar environment in all of our pieces of society. So I would say, even if the stuff about the playground and the swimming pools don't feel overly relevant to you, how do those threads that I sort of pulled on, Indigenous legislation, immigration policies, racist science, how do you think those may have shaped and continue to shape the area in which you're working, and where might you be able to intervene so that the future might look a little bit differently? So I would say, yeah, the rec pieces might not be as applicable to you, but the history pieces definitely are. Nobody in Canada is outside of that stuff. And so how is that continuing to shape the way in which you do your work? And then where can you make changes based on maybe some of this new knowledge that you have?
Great. We have a comment from Tammy just saying that really appreciate your closing point, focus on lived experience, agency, and redirecting resources to groups that have been excluded to determine and control their own activities. Historically, underpinning of this is so valuable. Thank you. Can you speak more about how to engage with systemic changes at a municipal level? Like how to engage with council?
This is an interesting one, and I will mumble through it because I don't have an answer for you, but I did, Michael Jans and I just went for coffee. He reached out to me, he's got a hold of my book, and I'm in Edmonton, obviously, and we've been kind of trying to figure out what that might look like at a Edmonton level. And what we've come up with at this point is to get a group of like-minded individuals together and start feeding him some answers to the questions he might have, so that he's got the speaking notes that we would like him to have at council, and giving him the resources to share with other members of council. So I don't know if it's a task force that you could create at a municipal level. I would argue, if that is the case, that you definitely need to have equity denied folks represented on that committee. I think we do a great job, those of us who are, I think women do it especially well, middle-class white women, sort of that white savior approach to the work. And again, sort of to Tammy's point, we need to be giving people their own voice, their own agency. They need to have self-determination in these spaces, because what we think might be best might not be what they want to do. And we may be, based on their lived experience, like we have no idea what is necessary or needed. So that could be one maybe example. And I can think about it a bit more. Again, it's so hard. It's so easy to critique and kind of deconstruct what's wrong with the system. But they're hundreds and hundreds of years old. So recreating something and transforming it is a lot harder. And that's going to take more than one academic and 6 years. It's going to take like big collectives and lots of brains and lots of time to think and imagine differently. So that would be another actual strategy, is carve out time with your colleagues to imagine and think, how could this be different? Because unless we have sort of new ideas and new ways of doing, nothing's going to change. And again, we don't really have time for that in our current sort of environment. So that would be another strategy I would offer.
That's a great strategy. And I appreciate the piece about getting kind of everybody at the table, especially Tammy said, loves the term equity denied, puts the focus on the deniers, not the people who have been excluded, marginalized. Yeah, that's the first time I've heard that as well. Let's see. I know we're a little bit over time, but this is some good conversation. Let's just.
I'm good to keep going.
Is that okay, Lisa? Yeah, for those who need to get going, we totally understand. Feel free to slip out of the webinar if you need to. We have another question from Kathy. She said, "This is the best compilation of historic issues I have ever seen." My question is,
lots of tears.
No, I'm like, that's very cool. My question is about older adults. Is focusing programs on older adults enough, or do we need to go to the populations that have been excluded as well? Would you include older adults, even though white and group that needs support for recreation, the AE white?
Yeah, I think this, in sort of answering your question, I'd point you to the notion of intersectionality. So even like if somebody is in the category of older adult, I don't know what the actual correct term is at this point, but they're going to have different identities that intersect to influence whether or not they can participate. So I would say right now, I think a lot of the work that we are doing with seniors is driven largely by sort of a white middle class boomer population. And so where are the equity denied folks? Because it's not that there aren't equity denied folks in that age category. So again, I would say that, yes, I absolutely think all ages should have the right and opportunity to participate, but it's looking at the intersections in terms of how have they been excluded, and then therefore how are we going to try and remove barriers for them, whether that's reallocating resources or creating different opportunities. I know I was just writing a paper on sort of the 3 types of sport that I argue that we have. And there's the Filipino Basketball League in Edmonton just added, it's called the Grandpa League. And so like there are other non-traditional, non-government funded organizations that are working across age groups. Intergenerational activities are very common too for a lot of equity denied folks. So again, these non-dominant opportunities that aren't necessarily funded by our traditional or dominant funding bodies. There's lots of examples out there if we take the time to look and listen. I think we do a horrible job of that because we're so caught up in just status quo. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I did my best.
Yeah, I think that kind of going back to that intersectionalities and looking at that is a great piece. We had one more question, and I think they might have left the chat, but I might connect with them after because I missed their question in the chat box. Could you talk about your experiences talking about your research with recreation decision makers?
Yeah.
So what does that look like?
So I've been doing this presentation now for over a year. The first 4 or 5 times I presented outside of an academic audience, it was honestly rough. I got a lot of pushback. People were angry, and I don't think I did enough to frame the presentation. So the context slides that I now use have been based on some of the feedback that I got. But but I think people felt that I was sort of attacking a profession and career that they love and don't see to be problematic. That being said, I have modified my presentation a little bit based on some of the feedback that I've received. And I also have a champion of mainly retired rec professionals who've given the work a lot of credibility. So in the past little while, like I've presented at the ARPA Leaders Summit, I did 2 presentations at the last ARPA conference. I've presented to Canadian Parks and Recreation, and then the Canadian Training Network for Parks and Recreation has actually just put in a grant for me to go across the country and deliver this in various provinces at various conferences. So I think people are ready to hear it at this point, and I am getting invited to do a lot of talks. I just did one with the city of Calgary, and I do the presentation, and we just have more of an organic conversation afterwards to talk about how this applies to their sort of recreation context more specifically. So to answer your question, initially, I would say rec practitioners were very defensive. In the last 6 months, I don't know if it's because EDI has become more of a priority, or people are just talking about the presentation a lot. I know a lot of practitioners are sort of sharing that they're enjoying it and have learned something through it, but everybody has been generous and open. And I would say the majority of people are wanting more of the now what can we do? Which is tricky because I can't necessarily offer that. But I do think that we are in a good moment to figure out what mechanisms do we need to continue to have these conversations, because it is going to take a lot more dialogue. And again, that notion of imagination is so vital. We've done, like I demonstrated, we've been doing the same thing since recreation started basically in this country, and we think that we're innovative and social innovators and doing new things, and I would argue that we haven't. So how are we creating those spaces and finding the time to really imagine together and think differently? And yeah, I can't stress the importance of that enough.
Well, I think that last little sentiment left us on a really good note there. So I'll wrap it up now because it looks like we don't have any more questions. Just people really saying like thank you so much to you, Lisa, for providing this information. I think people are also excited to potentially connect with you in some way. And yeah, I wanted to say on behalf of ARPA and Communities Choose Well, thank you so much for jumping on this webinar so quickly. And I'm excited to hear like the initiatives that people start doing and like coming from learning about this as well.
Well, thank you. This is the largest audience I've had for one of these sessions. So
yeah, and people are like asking if they can have the recording and stuff. So for everyone who's wondering, the recording will be available. So we will send that out.
And I'm happy to connect about talking to individual groups, organizations. Again, my email's up there. Feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and if you don't end up getting her email today, definitely feel free to reach out to me, and I can send that information to Lisa as well. So thanks again, Lisa. I'll wrap up and end the webinar now.
Perfect. Thanks, Madison. Have a good day, everybody.